It was the summer before my junior year of high school, and I'd been going to sleepaway camps for as long as I could remember. That summer was no different, though this time I was at a new kind of camp where we'd be hiking a section of the Appalachian Trail for 2 weeks instead of staying on the campgrounds. This was something completely new for me, but I was excited since I've always been the adventurous type. On this trip, it was me, 2 female leaders, and 9 other girls. A few days into the hike, we had started getting to know each other, but we were also already pretty comfortable together. We stopped for lunch near a spring, our spot being on the trail, but close to a section where a road passed by. While eating, we all noticed a van that looked like one of those old, sketchy types, driving back and forth along the road. No one said anything, but we all saw it. After a few minutes of the van passing, it finally pulled onto the trail, near where we were sitting. It just stayed there for a bit, and we assumed the driver was lost or looking for a restroom since nobody commented on it. Then, suddenly, a man got out of the van, ran over to us and started yelling, "Does anyone know CPR? My brother is having a seizure." Immediately, our 2 leaders rushed over to the van and disappeared for several minutes. Meanwhile, the rest of us started feeling uneasy. Someone mentioned, "Didn't that van drive by us a few times?" And others wondered why he would say "brother" in such an odd situation. When the leaders finally came back, they had blank expressions on their faces and wouldn't answer any of our questions. That's when the man returned, but this time holding some creepy puppets, like those plastic Halloween decorations people put on their porches, only without the candy. He tried talking to us, but no one responded. We just kept eating quietly. In an eerie voice, he said, "My puppet likes girls." He also claimed it could talk and pressed a button on its foot. After a while, he seemed to get the hint and went back to his van. He sat there for what felt like forever, with the door open and loud music blasting. Eventually, he drove off and we quickly packed up and left the area. Though it wasn't a terrifying experience, it was unsettling, and the day only got stranger. As we continued our hike, we talked about the odd man with the puppets for a while, then started telling scary stories until we reached our campsite. We arrived early, so we had a lot of daylight left. Being a group of teenage girls, we got bored fast and started wandering around. We flirted with some boys who were nearby, but they eventually lost interest and left. Afterward, we decided to play a game called Elephants and Gazelles, a game that works best with a big group. Conveniently, 3 guys approached us, introducing themselves, not the same boys we had been flirting with earlier. Since they seemed friendly, one of the girls invited them to join our game. That's when things got weird. During the breaks, people shared personal stories to get to know each other better, even though us girls had already been chatting nonstop for days. Out of the blue, one of the guys announced that 2 of them were trans. Now, I have no issue with people living their truth, but it just felt strange that it was mentioned out of nowhere, given we barely knew them. They went on to talk about how they were trying to start a reality show about 3 trans men living in New York, with the 3rd member of their group, who wasn't trans, pretending to be part of the show. Again, I didn't think anything was wrong with them being trans. It was just odd how they brought it up. Later, they were whispering among themselves and started laughing loudly. One of them shouted, "That's funny because your dad's in jail." At this point, we were all feeling a little uncomfortable. Trying to break the tension, one of the girls told them about the strange man with the puppets we'd met earlier. To our shock, they laughed and said that was their uncle, who had dropped them off earlier in the day. Not long after, they said they were tired and headed back to their tent, much to our relief. That evening, a few girls went to the bathroom and walked past their tent on the way. They later said they heard them singing Justin Timberlake songs, and on their way back, they overheard one of the guys shout, "Tickle fight!" It rained heavily that night, and when we woke up the next morning, their tent was gone. We were surprised since we usually got up early. Just before we left, I found a folded piece of paper on a tree stump near our tent. It read, We got soaked in the rain and had to leave. We'll miss all of you and the great friendships we made. Heart. The weird guys who get no respect. I'm still not sure what was stranger, that they told us all those random things or that they were somehow related to the creepy puppet man. Three years ago, in Los Angeles, my partner and I, after planning for 5 years, both turned 29. We sold everything we had, including my car, and packed up his SUV, setting out to travel across the US and Canada. We could be described as wandering adventurers, as we often chase good weather and camp in state parks or hike deep into the wilderness for a few days at a time. My brother jokes that we're modern-day nomads. We don't live entirely off-grid, but between the two of us, we share one prepaid phone for emergencies and checking in with family, and I use a laptop for work. I'm a freelance writer and content creator, primarily writing technical papers and web content for a robotics company. Our goal is to live with minimal debt and keep our expenses low. I only use free Wi-Fi, so once or twice a week, we head to a city with a coffee shop for work. This background helps explain how simply we live. We're not into social media and don't know much about apps like Instagram. Last summer, we decided to explore the wilderness of Arkansas, a state not commonly visited by other hikers, though we had read that it has stunning landscapes. The park we visited had relaxed rules. We didn't need a permit, just had to follow a few basic guidelines, but no official check-in was required. We had all our gear and planned a 6-day hike, 3 days in and 3 days out. During our trek, we didn't see or hear another person. On one evening, as we prepared to find a campsite off the trail before dusk, we followed what looked like an animal path. About half a mile out, we came across a small green tent, nearly hidden in the foliage. We almost stumbled upon it by accident. Some hikers prefer privacy, while others are more social, like us. We've had great experiences camping near other travelers, sharing stories and food. About 30 yards from the tent, the flap was closed, so my partner called out to announce our presence. There was no response, no movement. We assumed the occupant wasn't around or didn't want to be disturbed, so we moved on to find our own campsite. We set up, camped through the night, and heard nothing unusual. By the next day, we had almost forgotten about the green tent until we saw it again on day 5 as we neared the end of our hike. It's not uncommon to encounter the same campsite, but most hikers keep moving, so we didn't expect to see it. This time, the tent flap was open. My partner called out again, but there was still no response. My partner wanted to check it out, thinking someone might be injured. I was uneasy from the start. While we've never had bad experiences, we've heard stories about reclusive individuals who don't want company and might be armed. But my partner assured me it would be fine, and if necessary, we could offer peace in the form of a small gift and move on. As we got closer, the smell hit us. It was the unmistakable stench of decay. My partner, who had been calling out, stopped when he smelled it too. He turned to me and said, "What if there's a body?" My skin crawled. I had never seen a body before, and I didn't want to start now. The closer we got, the stronger the odor became. I was certain we were about to find a dead person inside. What we found was worse. Outside the tent was a dead deer. Its legs were swarmed with flies, and it looked like they had been partially cut and then ripped off. It was a gruesome sight. Inside the tent was the deer's body and head, with the middle part wrapped in a blood-soaked blue blanket. The deer was lying on its side, with its tail cut off and its private areas covered in dried blood, as if something had violated it. The same was true for its mouth, which was twisted at a disturbing angle. The tent was open, so we could see everything without stepping inside. Not that we would have anyway. The smell was overwhelming. There was an almost empty bottle of baby oil and a stained kitchen towel. That was it. I broke down in tears and begged my partner to leave. He could only manage a "what the hell?" before we turned and ran back to the trail. We kept moving until dusk, setting up camp much closer to the trail than usual. Neither of us slept that night. We didn't light a fire or use headlamps, sitting in the dark and whispering to each other, going over what we had just seen. Every noise made us jump. I kept imagining the person responsible for the scene tracking us down at dawn. We packed up and left, stopping at the ranger station to report what we had found. The ranger, a young guy around our age, looked just as horrified as we felt. He took notes while we pointed out the location on a map. When he asked if we knew how the deer had been killed, we realized we hadn't even considered that. We had assumed it had been shot, but there were no visible wounds. Since then, we've shortened our backcountry hikes and are much less eager to call out to other campsites. And we've never approached another abandoned tent again. About 6 years ago, I was around 11 and my brother was 25. At the time, my brother had been serving in the military for several years and was getting ready to go on his second deployment to the Middle East. He had recently finished his Special Forces training and was a qualified Special Forces engineer. My brother wasn't someone to mess with. Since we both loved the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a hiking trip before his 9-month deployment. We decided to head to a remote wilderness area in northern Mississippi for the trip. Everything was going smoothly until the third night. Around 8 p.m., we were sitting by our campfire after dinner, talking about random stuff like guns and things. Our campsite was about 50 yards from a stream and roughly the same distance from a trail, forming a rough triangle between the stream, the trail, and our camp. It was summer, so it wasn't completely dark yet when 2 guys who looked to be in their late 20s showed up. They asked if we'd seen any wild hogs while hiking. We had, so we told them. They were polite enough, but something about them made me feel uneasy. They had scruffy facial hair, dirty clothes, and greasy hair. My brother called them good old boys, but they looked like they'd come straight out of a backwoods horror movie. They lingered a little longer than necessary, asking how long we'd been camping and how much longer we were staying. I got the sense they were sizing us up. They eventually left, but the whole encounter left me feeling uneasy. My brother didn't seem worried, though a few hours later, I woke up to the sound of dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, but they sounded close, maybe 100 yards away. My heart was pounding, so I kicked my brother to wake him up. He whispered, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for about an hour. Stay still and be quiet." At this point, I was scared out of my mind. We could hear occasional shouts from different directions, but they didn't seem to be coming closer. After a few minutes, my brother whispered that they were probably hunting hogs using dogs. That gave me a little relief, but I was still uneasy. Somehow, I managed to fall back asleep. I woke up again a few hours later, around 2 a.m., to my brother shaking me awake. He told me to quietly put on my shoes and follow him. I could still hear the dogs barking, but they were farther away. Without asking any questions, I did as he said. He had me climb on his back, and we moved about 50 yards into the woods, towards where the trail met the stream and hid in some bushes. From our position on a hill, we had a clear view of our campsite. My brother pulled out his pistol, an HK, and kept watch while I tried to stay quiet. A group of 5 men, accompanied by 3 or 4 dogs, arrived at our camp. 2 of the men had guns, either rifles or shotguns. The dogs were going crazy, clearly having caught our scent. At this point, I was terrified. My brother later told me they were talking about us, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. They hung around our camp for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around. My brother whispered to me, "If they come this way, run. Don't stop, don't look back, and stay off the trail." He handed me a flashlight with a red filter, telling me to keep it on to preserve my night vision. As we lay there, I felt a mix of fear and adrenaline. I was scared, But my brother's calmness gave me some confidence. Suddenly, the men started yelling and firing their guns into the woods. My brother pulled me behind the hill, protecting me from the gunfire. After a few more shots, they began walking away. A few minutes later, we heard sirens and saw flashing lights. It turned out that while I was asleep earlier, my brother had called for help using a satellite phone our family kept for emergencies. Forest rangers and game wardens arrived, and the men quickly fled. My brother signaled to the rangers, who chased after the men. Once the danger had passed, we packed up our campsite and waited for the game wardens to return. They gave us a ride back to the main staging area in their truck. On the way back, my brother told me how brave I'd been and asked if I wanted to tell our parents what had happened. I asked him not to because I didn't want them to stop letting me go camping. My family has owned a cabin in the Shasta National Forest for generations, and my sister and I always spent our summers there. It's stunning, especially for those of us who grew up in dry West Texas. The forest is lush, the mountain air cool, and it was always a much-needed break from the heat and dust of our ranch. My dad, an ex-military man, made sure we were well-trained in outdoor survival skills. We fished, hunted, camped, and hiked often. What was fun for us probably felt like a mission for him to prepare us. We would spend weeks during summer hiking the trails, exploring old cabins, and visiting remnants of the past, like an old water project that diverted water for the nearby river back in the late 1800s. It's a beautiful place, full of wildlife and with high mountain lakes that shimmer in the sun. This particular event took place when I was in college, and my younger sister was still in high school. My dad, tied up with work, would come up periodically to visit us while we stayed with our mom, who spent most of her time in town painting or relaxing around the cabin. It was late June, maybe early July, when we decided to hike up to Hidden Lake, one of my favorite spots. When you see the lake from a certain angle, it looks like a heart. We were well prepared for the hike that day with small packs, water, snacks, and hammocks. The plan was to set up the hammocks by the lake and just relax. I'm definitely an outdoor type and swear that if you're quiet enough, you can hear the trees speak. My dad had always made sure we carried knives while hiking just in case. Since our family cabin was already far into the valley, we set off on foot towards the trailhead. To reach Hidden Lake, you have to follow another trail to Fork Lake and then veer off. We passed a few other hikers heading to Fork Lake, but it seemed like Hidden Lake would be ours alone. The trail was steep and winding, but the payoff at the top was worth it. The lake was pristine, shimmering in emerald green. We were alone. We walked around the lake before heading into the tree line to find a good spot to hang our hammocks. As we entered the trees, my sister suddenly said, "Do you smell that?" I did. It was the strong scent of blood, unmistakable from our hunting experience. We soon found the source, a deer carcass, but it wasn't just the carcass that disturbed us. Its organs had been placed in a circle around it, with small piles of rocks in between. It wasn't just a butchered animal. It felt like some sort of ritual arrangement. My sister was about to call my name when we both saw him. He was standing about 20 feet away, half hidden by the trees, covered in blood with hardly any clothes on. It looked like he had just crawled out of the deer. He didn't speak or move, just stared at us, his eyes wide and wild. My dad had always taught us to take control of any situation where we felt threatened, so I did what I could to surprise him. "Nice kill," I said. "Did you use a bow?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring. My sister was ready to run, and I could feel the tension in her. I placed my hand on my knife, not to attack, but to show him I wasn't defenseless. I kept eye contact with him the whole time, trying to project confidence. He seemed like he was in his early 30s, though it was hard to tell under all the dirt and blood. I stepped back slowly, signaling my sister to follow. She moved behind me as I asked again, Good hunting day? He remained silent, like a statue, not moving an inch. We edged back toward the lake and started to make our way around it, quickening our pace. My sister was visibly shaken, and I was mostly angry. How dare he ruin this place we loved so much? As we reached the trailhead, I scanned the tree line, half expecting him to follow, but he didn't. We picked up our pace, almost jogging down the trail, not speaking about what had just happened. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept glancing back, but there was no sign of him until the first pebble hit us. Someone was throwing rocks at us, and it could only be him. My sister sped up, almost running now, but I was furious. I yelled back, telling him to go back to his deer and leave us alone. The pebbles stopped, but then we started hearing growling and barking noises. My sister said, "Is he growling at us?" I told her to ignore it and keep moving. He followed us the whole way, growling and making strange noises, but never showing himself. As we neared the point where our trail joined the Fork Lake Trail, he finally seemed to back off. We didn't stop until we were well down the trail, and even then, my sister refused to look back. As we talked about what happened, she insisted that he was dangerous, and we had been in real danger. I thought he was just some crazy guy trying to scare two girls. When we told our parents, my dad didn't like what he heard. He taught us more self-defense after that and forbade us from hiking alone ever again. We didn't hike that trail for years after the incident. The forest, my sanctuary, had felt unsafe for the first time in my life. I didn't know then, but when we got back, my mom had called some neighbors. A few men hiked up to check the area the next day. They found the deer carcass and some empty hiking packs near a campsite further into the woods, but no sign of the man. The Appalachian Trail is a well-known hiking route with a strong community surrounding it. People often come together at popular camping spots where there's food, drinks, and good company. In fact, one of my other friends met his partner while hiking alone on the trail. Knowing how friendly the trail community was, my friend thought she would be safe on her own journey. For the first few nights, she camped with different groups of people she met along the way, and everything was fine. They shared stories, food, drinks, and enjoyed typical camping activities like making s'mores. On the fourth night, she decided to camp alone for the first time. Although she felt a little uneasy, she brushed it off as nerves after having such a good time with others earlier. For the next few nights, she continued camping by herself, but each night, the feeling of nervousness grew stronger. She began to sense that something or someone was watching her. To make matters worse, she noticed that some of her belongings weren't exactly where she had left them the night before, although she wasn't sure if she was just imagining it. The feeling became so intense that she decided to join other campers again for the next couple of nights, feeling somewhat foolish for her fear. However, after a few days of camping with others, she tried solo camping again. But the unsettling feeling returned, stronger than ever. It became so overwhelming that she decided to abandon her plan of completing the trail solo. She made up an excuse about spraining her ankle and returned home, feeling embarrassed for letting a mere feeling make her quit. A few weeks later, she was feeling nostalgic and decided to go through the photos from her trip on her digital camera, which she hadn't touched since she got back. She scrolled through pictures of the scenery and the people she had met. But then, she came across a strange photo, one of her sleeping in her tent, taken from inside. At first, she thought maybe someone she met along the way had taken her camera as a joke and snapped the picture. But as she continued flipping through the photos, she found more photos of her sleeping at campsites where she was completely alone. There were pictures from each night she camped alone, all of her asleep in her tent. Needless to say, she gave up on her dream of solo hiking after that discovery. A few weeks ago, my girlfriend Sarah and I decided to take a spontaneous hike on a trail we found near Santa Monica. We originally planned to go hiking at another spot, but traffic made it too far to reach, so we settled on this closer one after finding it on Yelp. Once we found the trailhead, we began our hike to a barely there waterfall because California had been experiencing a drought. While hiking, we passed by 3 guys, 2 of them shirtless and muddy, who greeted us. After they passed, Sarah joked that they seemed sketchy and probably up to no good. To ease her mind, I handed her my spare knife, which I always carry for safety. After we reached the waterfall and started heading back, we heard the sound of leaves crunching and being stomped on aggressively from the direction of a ravine next to the trail. We stopped and turned to check where the noise was coming from. I suggested that maybe a tree was about to fall since there were a few with exposed roots nearby. Sarah quickly responded, "That doesn't sound like a tree falling, Mike." The rustling sound grew louder and more frequent, as if something was rapidly getting closer and making its way up the ravine toward us. When I saw some tall plants shaking nearby, I yelled at Sarah to run. We both started sprinting, with whatever was making the noise seemingly chasing us from the ravine. At one point, it even felt like it was trying to cut us off from the only way out of the trail. During the run, I realized Sarah should be in front because she's a faster sprinter while I'm more of a distance runner. I quickly grabbed her arm, pulled her ahead of me, and told her to keep going. As we ran, I couldn't help but glance back, like in those horror movies where people always look behind them. Bad idea. When I turned, I saw a bush taller than me. I'm 5 feet 5 inches, moving aggressively. That freaked me out, and I ran even faster. I in my panic. I missed seeing a dip in the trail and ended up injuring my recently healed ankle. It slowed me down a bit, but Sarah slowed down with me. I told her to keep going. After some distance, we finally stopped to catch our breath, drink some water, and try to make sense of what just happened. I told Sarah to take out the knife I gave her while I pulled out my small pocket knife. We discussed what we'd do if the noise came closer, agreeing that she should stay ahead since she could run faster, and I would hold off whatever it was if needed. Thanks to my martial arts background, as we continued walking the trail, I tried to lighten the mood by joking. "See? This is where your sprinter genes come in handy." Just as I said that, the rustling noise started again. We both sprinted as fast as we could away from whatever was still pursuing us. The funny part was when, up ahead, we saw 2 more hikers. Sarah quickly put her knife away while I was behind her, awkwardly holding my tiny pocket knife, yelling at her to stop so I could hide it. I didn't want to look like some crazy person chasing her with a knife. Eventually, we saw more people with their dogs heading toward the waterfall, and we felt safer. Once we made it back to the street, we drank more water and tried to figure out what had happened. Sarah thought maybe one of the guys we passed earlier had hidden in the ravine to scare us. To this day, we're still unsure what it was. The closest guess we had was that it might have been a coyote, especially after reading that one had been spotted in the area a few months back. But I don't fully believe it was a coyote. It moved too fast and seemed too large. I just told Sarah it could have been one to calm her down since she gets scared by things like that. Whatever it was, it definitely gave us a good scare as we hurried off that trail. A few years back, I went on a hike in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was supposed to be a simple day hike with 2 of my buddies. As we got into the first day, one of them started feeling sick and decided to head back. My other friend went with him, just in case things got worse. They told me to keep going, so I did, since I'd been looking forward to the hike for a long time. As evening started to fall, I came across a small open area in the woods. In the middle of it was a table covered in tools and cans of spray paint. On top of the table was an elaborate dollhouse, about 3 feet tall. Its windows and walls were wide open, as if it had just been painted and was drying. The smell of fresh spray paint still lingered in the air around it. On the back of the house, there was a photo stuck to it, a family picture that looked like it was from the 80s. Everyone in the photo had a strange, uncomfortable expression, like they didn't want to be there or were forced to pose. They didn't look scared, just uneasy. I left the dollhouse and kept going, wanting to reach my campsite before nightfall. The wind was picking up, and in the distance, I heard a branch snap and fall to the ground, which startled me. I found my campsite but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling about that dollhouse in the middle of nowhere. I decided not to camp out in the open, in case whoever was working on it came by. I had a small one-person tent, just big enough for me to lie down in. I set it up behind some thick bushes, with one side blocked by a tall row of rocks. I felt glad for the cover, not only because I was hidden, but also because the rocks helped block the cold wind that was blowing down from the mountains. That night, the sound of the wind through the trees was actually pretty calming, and I think I fell asleep right away. At some point, I woke up with a jolt, not sure why, but with the faint echo of a sound lingering in my head. I lay there in the dark, and suddenly I had the feeling that someone was nearby. I listened carefully, trying to hear over the wind. After a moment, I heard a man's voice in the distance. It was harsh and rapid at first, then got softer. He was too far away for me to understand what he was saying, but close enough that I could hear the tone and rhythm of his voice. He sounded like he was talking to himself, scolding himself even. Then, his voice got louder, and I could hear his footsteps crashing through the brush, coming straight towards me. He passed just a few feet away from where I was hiding. By this time, my eyes had adjusted a little to the moonlight, but I couldn't see much, just a big, bulky figure, maybe around 6 feet 6 inches and heavy set. He was carrying something long under his arm, probably a rolled up tent. He was muttering about someone's face haunting him, and then, strangely, his tone changed. He started talking in a childlike voice about cheese and crackers. The guy was clearly not in his right mind. After a while, he kept walking, his voice fading as he moved further away, and eventually I couldn't hear him anymore. I barely slept the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up my things and hiked back to town as fast as I could. When I passed through the clearing again, the dollhouse was gone. This all happened a few years ago, but it still gives me chills thinking about it. About 8 months ago, my partner and I had just gotten a new 7-month-old boxer pup to keep our 4-year-old Labrador company. We thought it would be fun to take them on a walk in the countryside. We live near a big city called York in northern England and decided to walk in a rural area north of a river that flows into the sea. After reaching a small village near a local World War II fort, we chose to walk around and through the small wooded patches near a nature reserve. As we walked along a grassy hill towards the woods, my partner noticed 2 young men approaching from the woods, walking diagonally as if they were trying to intercept us. I wondered if they were involved in a World War II reenactment because they were both wearing camo pants and covered in dirt. At first, I didn't think much of them, assuming they just passed by, but as they came closer, it was clear they were heading straight for us. They stopped about 10 feet away and one of them spoke, but the way he talked still unsettles me. It was rude and almost nonsensical. He asked where we were heading, and we told him we weren't sure, just exploring. He seemed disappointed and suggested we take his route through the woods, claiming it led to a nice spot with benches for resting. While he talked, the other guy kept a close eye on our dogs, almost as if he didn't want to lose sight of them. Since we didn't know much about the area and hadn't seen anyone else around, we followed his suggestion. They pointed to an opening in the woods, and we continued walking. The woods were thick, blocking out about 1/3 of the sunlight, and as I glanced back, I saw the 2 men hadn't left but were watching us walk away. The path through the woods seemed man-made, as it was the only clear trail. About 2 minutes in, our Labrador started sniffing around a bush, which wasn't unusual since the dogs loved exploring. But then she began sniffing one spot intensely and rolled on the ground. When we went to check on her, we saw she was sniffing at a torn-up rubber pig mask smeared with some dark red liquid. It looked gross, and my partner quickly pulled the dog away, noticing flies buzzing around it. As we continued, the woods narrowed into a long, overgrown path. We could see a bend up ahead and agreed to turn back if it didn't lead anywhere. I walked ahead, preparing to snap a picture on my phone, when suddenly I felt several sharp stings on my neck, chin, and face. I gasped, and my partner rushed over, telling me to stay still. Carefully, he pulled thin wires away from my face. It turned out someone had strung fishing hooks along the path. We were both scared, confused, and furious. We rushed back to the car and drove home, still shaken. I don't want to sound paranoid, but as we drove away, I could have sworn I saw something in the rearview mirror peeking out from the woods.